When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, then I was at work beside him, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the sons of men. Proverbs 8. Joy deeper yet than woe is she, saith woe, hence go. Yet joy would have eternity, profound, profound eternity. From Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. One truly lives only when one dances. Isadora Duncan. Kind of an interesting quote to put at the beginning of this letter, which is the last letter of Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot, the letter on the card, the world. And what an interesting letter. I mean, of course, they're all interesting. But it starts off with this. It's full on creative elan, speaking about the artistic impulse, about creativity, and then quickly and almost abruptly turns to some warning about the belt of lies, we could call it, or the possibility of delusion, because he's connecting this creative impulse we see with artists, right? And he senses a similar activity in esoteric work, and which is both of them, enter into the either the zone of the Holy Spirit or the belt of lies, and you can't. In fact, it's almost like a step in initiation to go through the belt of lies. You have to go through it. As an artist and as an esotericist or as a hermeticist. And this is how he starts, right? He talks about the world as a work of art. I mean, this glorious image on the card, right? The last major arcanum of the tarot, he says on page 626, would suggest a conception of the world as rhythmic movement or dance of the female psyche, sustained by means of the orchestral accompaniment of the four primordial instincts, which gives the appearance of a rainbow of colors and forms, or in other words, that the world is a work of art. Right? And he says that the world is fundamentally neither a mechanism, nor an organism, nor even a social community, neither a school on a grand scale, nor a pedagogical institution for living beings, but rather a work of divine art. At one and the same time, a choreographic, musical, poetic, dramatic work of painting, sculpture, and architecture. Right? The idea of the world as a work of art is implicit in all cosmogonies, which explain the origin of the world through a creative act, or through a series of creative acts, as it is the case in Moses' Genesis. I'm surprised, actually, that he doesn't touch on Nikolai Berdyaev, whom we know he deeply admires, but he doesn't show up in this letter, which is kind of surprising. Now, and also he visits some figures he's never touched on. Edgar de Daquet is one of them. He's never quoted from him in the book until just the last pages here. And Daquet, this is on page 627 in the citation Tomberg supplies with, has an interesting thing that I'm going to connect it to a couple of things. And Daquet says, the splendor of inner reality is entirely lost for man who has attained to the maturity of rational thought, when he comes out of the childlike state of animated and living perception and is given over to laws of pure abstraction. Right? Thus, each time we are in the state of experiencing the idea in form, we are, like the child, within nature. And then he says, Goethe was such a child. And I agree. Goethe retained that ability to see the world like a child sees the world and ask the questions that a child asks. We've touched on this before. Other figures he doesn't mention, which I think are worth mentioning, and we've talked about them both before, who I think also learned how to see the world as a child again, who never lost the ability to play. And just what Sophia says in Proverbs, playing before him all the while, and I found delight in the sons of men, in the children of men. But the two figures I'm thinking of are Thomas Traherne and William Blake, who never seem to have lost that ability to inhabit the world as a child inhabits the world. And Traherne, I think he was 37 when he died. He was very young, though Blake lived to a good old, ripe old age, but never lost it. Never lost that sense of childlike wonder and enthusiasm. You think about this. From I was a school teacher for 16 years. Sit outside of a school when the school bell rings at the end of the day, and the kids come out of the school, yay! And then go out, sit outside of an office building and see what at quitting time, what the adults do when they come out. Usually, they're on the cell phone, trudging to the car. They don't. If they came out saying "Yay," they might be healthier. Because we should be celebrating. We have to go play now. And here's Tomberg's explanation of what made Goethe so remarkable. This is the bottom of 627. He conceived of the creative artistic act as an integral part of the creative activity which works in nature, where this activity becomes continued in man. For him, a flower which pushes forth from the soil and a poem which pushes forth from the soil of the soul of the poet are only two particular manifestations of the same creative, magical, artistic force, which he called metamorphosis. And that's it right there. And you can see that, and I think Goethe is such an exemplary figure of the sophiological impulse, even though it's certainly there in Faust, throughout the entire book of Faust, how these figures change from Gretchen to Helen to the Mater Gloriosa at the very end. The eternal feminine leads us ever onward. But also what Goethe noticed in nature, in a scientific engagement with nature that was likewise poetic. That's very much now. If we didn't say childlike, it's Edenic. It's Edenic. It's almost an unfallen. It's not entirely unfallen, but it's almost an unfallen glimpse into nature, and that's a good thing. And that's seeing Sophia. And I also like, as an aside, how Tomberg speaks of Faust as because Goethe was interested in metamorphosis. It's one of his famous books, Metamorphosis of Plants, also of metamorphosis of animals. Theory of Colors is kind of a book on metamorphosis, but Tomberg calls Faust nothing other than the metamorphosis of the human soul since the epoch of the Renaissance, which is a beautiful way to put it. And I think it's true. I think it's true what happens through that book. So he's big into this creative impulse in the beginning pages of letter 22. But then it comes with a warning, right? And this is at the bottom of 629 where he starts to talk about the danger, Will Robinson, right? And here's the danger. Do we not condemn ourselves to sterility by renouncing the elan of intoxication? Has not Baudelaire, an artist of genius, bequeathed us intoxication as the sole indispensable key for creation and artistic activity? Right. And then he lays it out on the table. For just as there is human art and art, so also there is cosmic divine creative art and cosmic art of mirages. And just as there are ecstasies and illuminations from the Holy Spirit, so there are intoxications from the spirit of mirage, which is named the false Holy Spirit in Christian Hermeticism. Here is a criterion for distinguishing them. If you seek for the joy of artistic creation, spiritual illumination, and mystical experience, you will inevitably more and more approach the sphere of the mirage and become more and more accessible to it. If you seek for truth through artistic creation, spiritual illumination, and mystical experience, you will then approach the sphere of the Holy Spirit, and you will open yourself more and more to the Holy Spirit. Now, I know this from experience. I mean, I have had a long career of songwriting and writing poetry and all kinds of esoteric investigations as well, until I published my first poetry book, which was in 2014, I think. But I probably wrote thousands of poems, and I went through a period where, I had put together different volumes of poetry. I was going to be able to publish this, and eventually I just burned them all, except for, I might have burned every single one of them, and started afresh. Which is, that was and I started fresh. That was probably 15 or 16 years ago. And I don't think there's a poem from before then that I kept. Because, and even though it was valuable experience going through that, but I certainly was going through the belt of mirages, the false Holy Spirit, because there is and you see it in artistic circles, this realm, this zone that one comes to and mistakes. Well, I shouldn't say mistakes. It is inspiration, but we mistake it for truth. And that's when I got to a certain point. I decided I had to burn it all, and I didn't care what happened from that point forward. My work from then on would be what I wanted it to be and grounded in my spiritual life. And that doesn't mean my poetry is all spiritual. Not at all. I mean, it's very rough. I shouldn't say rough, rugged sometimes. It's about farming half the time. Hard work. But it was very different, and I'm not saying that I work exclusively from the zone of the Holy Spirit now, but there's definitely a different inward disposition toward that activity than there was before. But I think, like I said, you have to go through it because you have to know what it is. Maybe it's a kind of temptation, but it's really learning the terrain, I think. The inner terrain where creative inspiration exists. You have to know where to go. It's like learning a city. You have to know where the good parts of the city are. You know, what parts to avoid. And so I think it's true. But Tomberg continues. He's talking about the mirage, the spirit of the mirage. And he says in the middle of 630, the joy which results from truth and belief which results from joy. Here is the key which opens the door to understanding the arcanum of the world as a work of art. For it is this arcanum which will reveal the world to us as a work of divine creative art. That is, the world of wisdom, who is at work beside him, rejoicing before him always. And it is this arcanum again which will reveal the world to us as a work of art of deceptive mirage, that is, the world of Maya, the great illusion, who plays her game unceasingly. Right? Or in other words, on the one hand, the world which reveals God by manifesting him, and on the other hand, the world which hides him by covering him. But whether it is a matter of a revelatory word or a deceptive word, whether it is a matter of the world seen in the light of the sphere of the spirit of truth or the sphere of the spirit of mirage, it is joy, the twofold joy, which plays the key role here. And I think what he does, he connected Sophia with the zone of the Holy Spirit. Now, there's a book called by Father Istvan Sheleni, who he's a Byzantine Catholic priest from Hungary, and I wrote the introduction to it. It's and in his book, he has a chapter questioning whether we should consider the Holy Spirit as Sophia. I mean, I don't think that's how it works, but you certainly there's, as Tomberg points out here, there's a particular relationship there. Maybe it's the Holy Soul. Maybe that's the way to think about it. It's the Holy Soul. But the point I'm trying to make is that the creative impulse when comes to it is a search for truth, is a joy in truth. You can't help but become a sophiologist in a way. I mean, even if you've never heard of sophiology. It's just how it works. You just come to that insight, and you can see it through poetry and music. You can sense those that stumbled into this kind of this insight, this realm of the sophiological. Okay, it's Edenic as well, and I certainly hear this in the music of Vaughan Williams. I mentioned that before. I mean, you think he definitely found his way there, organically found his way there, and I think which is the best way to find your way there. And to continue, let's see where we'll go here. And he touches a lot of things we've already said. I mean, part of this discovering this realm of the Holy Spirit it's like, as I just said, it's Edenic. It's finding paradise, right? And as he says on page 633, paradise was before the world of the struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest, right? And he's talking about Schopenhauer before that. But the point is this is what we discover. And even Schopenhauer was still talking about joy, even while he recognized, the Buddhist insight about suffering and the tragedy of the world as we live through it, and, as we suffer through it. But there's still joy, right? So he still could see to the Edenic layer, and which is why, again, Tomberg visits Proverbs 8 in this letter. Right? Such an important text. And here, and as I mentioned earlier, you have to go through this experience of the mirage, and he tells us why on page 634. For a sphere of mirages exists in the invisible world, which constitutes the principal trap for esotericists, Gnostics, and mystics, for all those who are seeking authentic spiritual experience. Rudolf Steiner named it the Belt of Lies. And in traditional Christian Hermeticism, it is called the sphere of the false Holy Spirit. This sphere, or belt, is closer to that of ordinary consciousness, so-called ego consciousness, than the sphere of the Holy Spirit, where saints sojourn and from whence they act on human terrestrial consciousness. Thus, in order to rise to the sphere of the saints in the celestial hierarchies, one has first to traverse, that is, to refuse to react to its attraction, the sphere of the false Holy Spirit, right? You, you have to encounter it. It's analogous, I think, to the guardian at the threshold. It's something it just is part of the work, part of the process. You know, it's a temptation. You know, and uh, in my own experience, be inexperience perhaps, or all kinds of psychological problems. I shouldn't say problems. Psychological triggers. Get in the way, and that need to be worked through, processed before you can overcome that temptation, or before you even can see what it is. Because if you were to look, say you were enrolled in a creative writing program, or you were majoring in music, or you were a musician, well, most of what you see in the musicians and artists around are people who are actually engaged in the false Holy Spirit, because that's what sells, in a way. But in order to come, well, and that you can make a living like that, right? And you can make a living, I guess, as someone who dwells in the realm of the Holy Spirit as well. Arvo Part as an example, right? But you can still make music from the false Holy Spirit, is the point I'm trying to make. You can still write poetry, but until you find something or someone, and it could even be through the historical record. I mean, for me, it was, the metaphysical poets, and Blake, and Wordsworth, Apollinaire, where I saw what shone through their poetry, and that's when you get to the point where you reject your times, or the tastes of the egregore, the poetic egregore, or we call it the musical egregore, right? And you want something more. You get a taste of the false, and you want the real. It just teases. And he continues on 635. I'll read some more of what he says here at the top of the page. The lure of the sphere of mirages, following the book of Proverbs, is therefore stolen water. And I also like what's the other? Right, stolen water. The other one was strange water. I like that one even better than stolen water. The mobile element which flows and sweeps consciousness away in a delicious current of easily won illuminations and inspirations, without consciousness having to make a moral effort, which is summarized in the 3 words: cross, prayer, and penitence. Here, consciousness finds itself in a state of flight and freedom, which dispenses with all, with no responsibility of rendering account to anyone at all about anything at all, as if the cross did not exist, receiving illuminations gratis, that it has not prayed for, free from all memory of sin, free of all remorse and all responsibility for sins and errors of the past, as if sin and error were trifles hardly worth remembering. Filled with joy, savoring the creative elan, consciousness gives itself unreservedly to visionary and inspired speculation, where every image and every thought which are presented to it appear to be revelations from above, imprints of seals of superhuman wisdom. This stolen water is all the more dangerous because it inundates the soul with floods of psychic energy, which is an entirely new experience, the door to the belief that it is a matter of supernatural interference. On the other hand, the illuminations that these floods convey tally with the most intimate inclinations and desires of the soul, which redouble their convincing force and their hold on it. It is thus that false prophets and messiahs arise. And also, I think that dangerous art arises. Jacques Maritain, for instance, wrote in one of his books on poetry, I can't remember which one, but he said, talking about making sin look attractive in literature or art or film, he said, when you do such a thing, It's like you send an angel among your brothers and it kills them without a sound, right? So I've always, I mean, I'm not a gigantic Maritain fan, but I could tattoo that line on someplace because it's worth keeping in mind because you really do. You know what are you sending out there, right? Because they have those images take on being, or they connect to beings. And it continues, right? And he lets go on Marxism and communism again. He wouldn't be too popular these days, right? But he lived through it. We romanticize it. He lived through it, right? But he says that, there's another example of the false Holy Spirit, which intoxicates, right? Right? And is revolution, isn't it? Now, we talked about Simone Weil a little bit before. Simone Weil had been a communist, but she rejected it in favor of Christianity, and she concluded that it is not religion but revolution, which is the opiate of the masses. I think that's a good one to think about. It is not religion but revolution, which is the opiate of the masses. And that's what Tomberg's getting to in his discussion of communism again. But then, as he's proceeding in his discussion about the sphere of mirages or the false Holy Spirit, and he says it in Hermeticism, it's Hermeticism's trial and danger, right? And we've talked about this how many times through our discussions of this book. I mean, how many times does he bring it up? And this is where he calls out esotericists and occultists disengaged from traditional Christianity or traditional religion. You could say Kabbalah as well, right? He said, page 638, they're independent spirits concerned about their freedom and rejecting all submission to an authority eternal to their own conscience, that these spirits end up by becoming sectarian esotericists with their own revelations and their own personal illuminations, as they are lacking the fruits of a disciplined training, and as there is no one of authority to whom they can turn at the times of danger, which spiritual experience holds in store for them, they easily fall prey to the lures of the sphere of mirages. Right? And when he's talking in the next page, he actually talks about this with the Eastern Church kind of rejecting the visions that come in a pictorial way, because it's so easy to be deceived. And also, and as he points out, he's talking about with Jung, it's inflation. It causes inflation, right? And it also can lead one to madness. Inflation is a kind of madness. And unchecked, it leads to spiritual megalomania. Right? So what does this mean then? Well, this is what most esotericists don't have, is spiritual direction. That's what you just said, right? They don't have anyone to check their experiences with. And we talked about this a little bit before, or early on, one of the first, I can't remember which letter it was. We were talking about Saint Teresa of Avila, right? Where, her spiritual director said, next time you see this Jesus person, throw holy water on him. And she would apologize to the Lord. He said, well, go ahead. And this is the need for spiritual direction in these circles. And hard to find, admittedly, but you need somebody. And that's the difficulty with, I would say, with the Hermetic path, is you certainly have the spiritual direction available through the church. And finding a good spiritual director might be difficult to do, but you can probably do it. But even just having someone who's on a similar path and you could just check the experiences against. Now, this is also dangerous because when I was younger, in my 20s, I was involved in a group that was, doing some stuff. And these people had a lot of experience, but they were. I didn't know it at the time. I mean, compared to me, their experience was deep, and they knew all this stuff. But you know, when I remember they kicked me out of the group for being too Christian. But what happened though was I thought they had wisdom and insight, but they knew a lot of trivia that I was kind of impressed by as a 23-year-old or whatever I was. But then I don't know, 10 or 15 years later, I was working, I think, on my master's degree, and I was looking for some kind of information, and I figured one of the guys I was in this lodge with would have some insight, and I called him up. I said, I'm working on whatever it was, and I said, do you have any recommendations for things to read? And I was shocked at how superficial the stuff he told me to look at was like, and I remember thinking, dang, that's all. But at that, when I was in my 22 or how old, or 23, I was so innocent and naive about this stuff that anybody who knew, you know, some esoteric trivia impressed me in a way. And they speak, they the experiences in that circle were not lacking in impressiveness, but wasn't grown enough spiritually or religiously, and I hadn't gone back to the church yet to really be able to discern what was going on. And so I'll just leave it at that, okay? But spiritual direction is an important step. It's also a step in humility, which, we know that one of the dangers of the path is a lack of humility. And this is why Tomberg, again, and he does right here, goes back to the 3 vows: chastity, poverty, and obedience. And he says on page 639, the chaste mind seeks the truth and not the joy of revelation of the truth, just as chaste love seeks union with the loved one and not the carnal pleasure of union. So essentially, if you're seeking the joy of the experience, that's not chastity, that's promiscuity. And he also says the poor mind refuses to drink the stolen water, or, as my preferred one, the strange water, since it seeks only what is essential to the life of the body, the life of the soul, and the life of the spirit. Right? And next, the obedient mind has an awake and cultivated sense of obedience, that is, the spiritual hearing of the will, which renders it capable of recognizing the voice of truth and distinguishing it from other voices. And that's what I had to develop. I mean, it took a long time and a lot of giant mistakes, but eventually I did, to a degree. I mean, you can still make mistakes. You can still be misled. No one's escaped. But with practice and age, you can develop a sense for it anyway, right? And it's just part of it. Because everybody goes through the temptation, and I had my battles there. And this is what this is, like I was saying, this is what Tomberg gets to on 640. He says, unfortunately, it is a fact that esotericists, in contrast to monks and nuns, tend as a general rule to make little of the vows of obedience, poverty, and chastity. They seem to have made their fundamental attitudes scientific, remember? Where one relies on intelligence alone. The result of this is often, very often, a game of intellectual fireworks, which, in contrast to the light of the sun, does not illumine, does not warm, and does not vivify. And I have seen that so many times. I can't even count how many times in those circles I was in my 20s. Which, rarely do I see people from those circles anymore. Very rarely. And it's sad to see people still stuck there in the belt of mirages, right? The belt of lies. and as he points out, the danger is with those intellectual mirages is that they're not they're not completely false, right? There's a little bit of truth mixed in with it, just like when people have experiences of demons or whether they're egregores or the hierarchy of the left, they never it's never totally out of left field. There's always some truth combined with it, which makes you consider that maybe the lie is true too because that other part was true. You know, it's just how it works. It's just how that realm is. So that's why you have to be careful. That's why you have to be grounded in the sacraments and prayer and meditation and contemplation. Otherwise, you're in trouble. It's just how it is. Keep holy water in the house, right? And it says even the sphere of mirages is also constantly at work to reshuffle facts relating to former lives and karmic relationships, right? This is why I told you before, I just don't really care to hear about people's past lives or what people think I did in a past life, because of that right there. Because, a little bit of truth mixed with a lot of hooey sometimes, most of the time. So I think it's just better left to the inner sanctum of your own soul and not to be, chattered about. Right? And this is, and then he says, right, because when we have these inner experiences of, say it's an insight about a past life or something, or some kind of other insight, and he says, this is why you need to learn how to be silent, sometimes for decades, because you have to let the experience rest. Don't have an experience and run out to start a school or something, or start a group. Let it rest. And it's hard to do, especially when you're younger. Man, it's hard to let it go because you want to share it with somebody. But that's part of the training, I guess. And he teases the beatniks in this section, who also want to perform, basically, right? You want to impress, but that's not what we're supposed to be about here. And he returns to Goethe. Now, and he says, this is a good insight. He says, artists like esotericists, this is page 642, are obliged to make their works past the trial of time so that the poisonous plants from the sphere of mirages can be uprooted and there remains only the wheat, pure and ripe. This is so important. And I think this is, to a degree, what happened with me. When I went through that period where I was burning all of my work from earlier in my life, because they started to look like weeds, poisonous weeds. And then I vowed never to write anything like that again. Never. Because I, part of it was that's what people wrote. So and I didn't have anybody around me, in the flesh, to help guide me or direct me. It was kind of on my own. So you have peers, but they were lost too. You know what I mean? So you have to find your way. Now, he's going through this and he's talking, he's setting up where he's going with his discussion of where this is going, where this book is going. What's he going to leave us with? And so this is why he started off with the creative elan, I think, in the beginning, and he gets to all these warnings in the second half of the letter, or even the last 2/3 of the letter, you could say. And on page 646, he's quoting Jung. And Jung, and this is important, Jung says, there still does not exist any effective protection against psychic epidemics. And these epidemics are infinitely more devastating than the worst catastrophes of nature. And a little bit later he says, a major danger for man emanates from the mass, that is, the crowd, at whose core the working of the unconscious accumulates, first muzzling, then stifling the pleas for reason on the part of the conscious. Every organization of a crowd constitutes a latent danger, like that of piling up dynamite. It's true. Freud warned about this too. Freud in his last years was really depressed after seeing World War II. He had no hope, especially in crowds. People in crowds are insane. And in fact, there's an interesting documentary, if you have seen it, in several parts, Adam Curtis's The Century of the Self, where he talks a lot about how governments and advertisers try to manage crowds, right, by different methods. But interesting, though, another person often maligned is Wilhelm Reich, and he had some great insights. I think he might have been a little crazy himself, but he had some great insights. One of the things he talked about was emotional plague, which he saw in crowds and in people that they kind of take into their bodies. Their bodies manifest their psychic disturbances, which manifests, he thought, as cancer. He just thought cancer was a manifestation of emotional plague, and he was trying to treat the cause and not the symptom. For him, cancer was the symptom, and emotional plague was the cause. So, but I think all three of those psychiatrists saw a similar thing and were trying to treat it in their own ways. They had different cures or different approaches to treatment, but they also had the same problem. It had to do with crowds. It had to do with the psychic epidemic that Jung talks about. But then, to go back to where Tomberg is heading, though, he is heading toward the minor arcana, right? And I think it's really tremendously insightful when he gets toward the end at page 653, where he lays out the four worlds of the Kabbalah and connects them to the tarot, to the different suits, right? And he also connects the face cards of the minor arcana to the different worlds in the Kabbalah. Like he says, the knave or the page is the world of action, the knight, the world of formation, the queen, the world of creation, and the king, the world of emanation. Pentacles, swords, cups, and wands correspond exactly to the structure of the sacred name, Yohe-Vohe, and consequently to the four elements. Wands represent the emanating principle, the Yod of the divine name. Cups represent the conceiving principle, the first He of the divine name. Swords represent the formative principle, the vow of the divine name. And pentacles symbolize the principle of form, the second He of the divine name. Right? Just brilliant stuff, right? The 56 minor arcana of the tarot are therefore simply a development from the last major arcanum of the tarot, the world, developed Kabbalistically, rigorously, and mathematically. And you can see the influence from his group in St. Petersburg, where systemization is pushed so far that one asks oneself involuntarily if it is not a matter of a rationalistic performance, pure and simple, right? And he may have modified his opinion about that approach as he revisited his early experiences and as he was writing this book. But here's what I want to talk about, because he does at the very end say that this is what he's handing off, right? Where does he say it? page 655. I invite you, dear unknown friend, to do this work yourself, to write in the manner of these letter meditations on the minor arcana of the tarot. It is to facilitate this task that I propose the following considerations, which can serve as a key to the minor arcana of the tarot. And I won't get into the whole thing right there. You can read it yourself. But now, what do you do with this information? Well, I think you have to take into account everything he just said about the joy, the intoxication, and the danger. Right? Now, he says you should write this. He didn't say write it and then publish it. Right? So now I have not done this. I've thought about it. And I still could do it. You know, I haven't felt called to do this, but I've thought about it. Since I've been preparing these lectures, I've thought about it some more. But I don't think I will do it. I have a lot of other projects I need to get to before I croak. But what I would ask you, though, is, if you want to take this on, take this on. But how do we take this on? Now, what I'm going to say right here is just advice. It's not to be taken as a law or anything other than just somebody who has lived through experiences and who has 9 children and has been a teacher for 30 years, from kindergarten through college or the university, is that I think to really do this the right way, if you're going to take this on, you cannot adopt Valentin Tomberg's language and rhetorical gestures, first of all. You have to make it your own. Part of the problem, I want to rip on Anthroposophist again, but Anthroposophist, one thing I dislike intensely about Sergei Prokofiev's work is that he tries too much to sound like Steiner. So don't do that. Don't adopt that language. Rudolf Steiner himself said, he wished every day he would want to give anthroposophy a new name because people get stuck on what they think it means, and he would just start fresh every day. So I would suggest not adopting Valentin Tomberg's language, his rhetorical moves. Another thing I would suggest, he didn't start writing this till he was in his 60s. And like he said, you have to let it rest. So maybe you have all these insights. And he started this when he was 17, really, in that group in St. Petersburg. So that's, he said it 45, but it's closer to 50 years by the time he was done with his book. So my hope for you is that you too will give it time. And I mean decades, if you can. If you're an old guy like me, you don't have decades. Maybe you have a couple decades, but you don't have decades and decades. But to let it sit, to let your insights rest, because there's no hurry. There's no hurry. And with that, my dear friends, I think I will bid you adieu, just like Valentin Tomberg does at the end of this. In fact, he wrote this. He finished the book, 2 weeks? I think this was actually the anniversary of my baptism, or right around there. But I was 5 years old when he finished the book. And interesting. So I'll bid you adieu. And thank you so much for spending this time with me. I'll see you again sometime.